And I think Nelson Mandela forced us to really examine what these issues are: forgiveness, equality, justice, freedom. Are we free? Are we not? What does it mean to forgive? What does it mean to embrace your enemy? What does it mean to say to your enemy, I forgive you? What does it mean to say, I reconcile with you?
We're going. We are looking at the view, look at the view. Natural to your right, look at the view. Look at the view all over. It's such a beautiful view. You have an envelope out. You come there, she notices you're there, takes an envelope out, he gives to you. Okay, look at the money. You go. Look at the money. Then you look at him.
Khalo Matabane is one of a generation of black South African filmmakers who rose to prominence after the end of apartheid in 1994. Today he is working on his first major television commercial. But his real passion, and the work he has been celebrated for, lies in documentary and drama.
When I started making documentaries, people used to say, your documentaries are so slow. I used to have these long static shots and everything else, and I realized that subconsciously I was influenced by growing up in a village where time sort of doesn't move, where time stands still, almost where shadows are longer, and there used to be nothing in the shots. The shots will be empty. When I grew up in the village, there was no television, there were no movies, but there was a sense of great storytelling. And my grandmother was a great storyteller. She used to tell me really great stories. Stories about Nelson Mandela, stories about the liberation struggle.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Khalo's latest project is his most ambitious to date, a documentary which 20 years after the end of apartheid attempts to make sense of the ideas and meaning of South Africa's greatest icon, Nelson Mandela.
My grandmother and the stories that she used to tell me of Nelson Mandela was of a revolutionary, a man who one day was going to come and walk in the middle of the streets. And I remember I used to imagine him walking in the dusty streets of my village with an AK-47 and a beret and leading an army. And I remember when I saw him on TV the day he was released, and that memory of him didn't match, that image of him didn't match my memory. And he looked frail. He had Winnie Mandela, he had a suit on. This is not the Nelson Mandela that I imagined. I always felt like I knew him, maybe because my family spoke so much about him. He always felt like a grandfather who was always there, but absent also.
While Nelson Mandela was called both freedom fighter and terrorist for most of his life, he became known around the world as a peacemaker.
Hi, Tata Mandela. When I started thinking of writing a letter to you, I had so many questions to ask you. But now all of a sudden, I'm not sure what to ask you or how to ask you. When I was a child, my grandmother spoke about you in a harsh tone. In my childish way, I imagined you differently. This revolutionary that was going to come back with guns blazing to defeat the enemy. I remember the day when you were released and the excitement I felt. When you started talking about reconciliation, I was stunned and maybe disappointed.
If we don't forgive them, then that feeling of bitterness and revenge will be there. And we are saying let us forget the past. Let's concern ourselves with the present and the future.
Over the years, I've come to realize that the more I've tried to get to know you, the more elusive you've become.
There are 3 words which, spoken together, express the triumph of freedom, democracy, and hope for the future. They are President Nelson Mandela.
Maybe the question is much more simpler than I thought. Who are you?
I love this man very much.
And because when you say Nelson Mandela, so many things come up. You know, on one hand, you have people who say he betrayed black people. You have other people that look at him as a saint, a person who managed to ensure there was no civil war or bloodbath in South Africa.
Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years and instead of revenge, opted for peace. He became famous for his policy of reconciliation between white and black people.
What happened? You know? What happened to the young revolutionary who called for an armed struggle, to the man who came out of prison many years later and spoke about forgiveness and reconciliation?
For his documentary, Khalo is interviewing opinion makers across the world, including Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer.
Letter to Mandela, slate 2, take 2.
Would you consider yourself to be a very forgiving person if you went through the system of repression and everything else? Do you think it would be important for you to forgive?
No, I must say I don't find it easy, if you ask me in myself, to forgive the people, not only who created, but who followed apartheid and who supported it, whether it was directly in the apartheid regime or whether it was, I think particularly of the money that flowed in for arms here from outside to prop up the apartheid state. And I was at, indeed, one of the first of the Truth Commission meetings with Desmond Tutu in charge then. And there were Chris Harney's killers being questioned. And then, of course, the whole idea of the Truth Commission is that people forgave and shook hands or embraced or whatever it was. And I found myself sitting next to Chris Harney's wife, Mrs. Harney. And she didn't say anything through the whole thing. And then, when it ended, she turned to me as a stranger, I didn't know her, I'd never met her, and said, I can't forgive these people. I want to see them in prison. And I've never forgotten that. I quite understood it. But as you say, probably Madiba wouldn't have agreed with her.
Khalo's other films have explored issues similar to the Mandela documentary. In his film, When We Were Black, childhood innocence is directly confronted with the brutality of the apartheid system.
And I think Nelson Mandela forced us to really examine what these issues are: forgiveness, equality, justice, freedom. Are we free? Are we not? What does it mean to forgive? What does it mean to embrace your enemy? What does it mean to say to your enemy, I forgive you? What does it mean to say, I reconcile with you? Except, maybe the curtain is it's not too much. You can only hope that the films that you make raise questions about these issues. I think when you have this arrogant ego that says your films are going to solve the problems of the world, I don't have that anymore. And in that way I feel free because I don't have that, at least that part, I don't have it anymore, that I'm going to save the world with my work.
Nikusakona. Oh, no. Nikusakona. Oh, nikusakona. Oh, niza kusakona. Akukozi Khalo. Nikusakona. Akukozi Nzinga. Nikusakona.
In his film, Story of a Beautiful Country, Khalo undertook a journey across South Africa and interviewed people about the state of the country in the back of a minibus taxi. Mandela's theme of forgiveness has been instrumental in building a bridge between the country's unjust past and its democratic present. Khalo himself is exploring the place of forgiveness in his own life.
And part of me, in my moments of anger, because I find that within myself, I'm not just a forgiving person. Like I find that I hold, and I'm like completely vicious, and I don't believe in, personally, I don't believe in forgiveness, on a personal level. Yeah. Like if you mess with me, I spend all my life trying to figure out how to mess with you. Okay, so and I know I'm completely unforgiving. Even with this, even after I've met people who tell me in this documentary how important it is to forgive and everything else, whatever, I'm like, that's beautiful saying, but my heart, I'm sorry, peace out. I want revenge, you know? And for me, part of me fantasizes. Okay, I'm not saying real. I'm saying fantasizes. So it's something deep thing about putting people against the wall and shooting them. Yeah. Really, part of me completely likes that idea where you tie them down, you have a firing squad, and you put them on the thing, and you get a firing squad, and you get shot, and your body lies there for the vultures to feed on. Okay, your body lies there for the vultures to feed on, and everyone else walking on the thing can see that.
Violence and crime are a major part of South Africa's daily reality, and a film such as Khalo's State of Violence asks the hard question of what happens to a society when a difficult past is not fully dealt with.
Everything is so political. I'm not conscious of the links between the films. Cut.
In the course of making his documentary, Khalo traveled to Robben Island, where Mandela had been imprisoned for many years. Khalo recounts his experiences with friends at a chic restaurant in Johannesburg.
You know, I've always been like, whatever, you know, the 27 years, whatever. When I went to Robben Island, I saw the cell, and I saw it had profound effect on me. Yeah. And if it doesn't have a profound effect on you, you're absolutely an animal. Yes, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you like Mandela or you don't like Mandela. But the issue is when I saw the cell and we filmed the cell, it was the first time I saw it because I've never gone to the cell. I was like, yeah, whatever, you know, it's for tourists and everything else. But when I went there, and when you see those things, when you see you are in that cell and you're like, whatever, and I realized that I can't even stay at my own place for more than a weekend without feeling caged. You know what I mean? Like the thing.
He was doing doing his push-ups, he was making his own bed, and he did the flowers that Errol Dorfman talks about.
Yeah, okay.
But the other thing, sorry, just because I was interested in what you said about the present, because you've been interviewing people, so Mandela has preoccupied a lot of your time. But the thing about the present is like, yeah, I agree with you. I think that too much time is spent, but somehow you have to understand the present. So that whole thing, that whole thing of like, we must forget the past. I'm always saying, no, hold on. You got to learn from the past, but also...
When you look at Che Guevara, it's simple. It's much more simpler. That's the thing. I think with Mandela, it's much more of a struggle because what is reality and what is fiction?
In his film, Conversations on a Sunday Afternoon, a fictional character walks through the gritty underbelly of Johannesburg in search for a real-life refugee. In many of his films, Khalo has blended documentary and fiction to come closer to the truth of South Africa. In his Mandela documentary, he uses similar stage techniques.
I've struggled for a long time with the Mandela documentary. Like, how should it be? How should it look like? What is the language? What is the approach? And all of a sudden, I thought, this icon, this global icon of the 20th century, when everyone says he's dying and there's a panic across the world, and I go back in time and I try to unpack who he is, but using time that is almost closing. And I thought that's beautiful. That's a simple construction of a documentary, because on one hand it's very philosophical, political, but it's also emotional, because at the end of while you are watching, you are aware that time is not on his side, and you're worried, is he gonna live through this documentary? Is he gonna die? What's gonna happen? So on the other hand, you're talking about forgiveness and reconciliation, but time is not there.
Sounds good. Take 14.
94-year-old former President Nelson Mandela is back in hospital due to a recurrence of a lung infection. President Jacob Zuma has appealed to the people of South Africa and the world to pray for the beloved Madiba to get well.
It's interesting, in the middle of this, I got a very strange email, actually. And it was just so strange and so everything else, and I thought it captured everything that it is about the contradiction of Madiba. And it was a little message from Naomi Campbell saying, it's going to be a great documentary about a great man I love. And I thought this is quite an exciting thing, because here you have a man who could possibly in one room have Charles Taylor, Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, like everyone who don't even agree, Naomi Campbell, David Beckham, all in one room.
Look, Madiba Mandela is not an icon. He's not a statue. He is a big, tall, flesh and blood man, even in his old age. And his whole life has been based on the fact that he believes in one thing, and that is that we are all human beings, and we all have the same needs, basically, and indeed the same meaning in this mystery that is human life.
What are the films about? They're about memory, they're about history, they're about interpretation of memory, misinterpretation of history, failure. They're about betrayal of oneself, betrayal of a dream, of a nation. I mean, you can try to be profound with all those things, but in the end, I think they're about what unsettles me and my day-to-day experience as a human being. I mean, I can go down and as an African, as a black South African, as whatever, as a village boy, as all those kind of things. But, but as a human being, I think more important as a human being, I think, we live in frightening times. And every day, the nightmare becomes more scary than the day before.
Welcome to Joy! Shoot me, you fucking shit! Don't shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me, you shit! Shoot!
If you are a black filmmaker or an African filmmaker, there is an expectation, I think, of the kind of films that you should make. Either they have to deal with machismo and the violence and the thing, and then people say, oh, that's how we are. The people that you portray, they embrace it because they say, this is how we are. And the people, the people who are considered the other, look at the lens and it satisfies their own stereotypes and thing about you.
Yeah, so
part of Khalo's success as filmmaker is his charming and relaxed interview style.
So I've been interviewing. I'll tell you that people have interviewed for 2 hours, and I got only about 3 minutes, as it happens, because also the idea is to get stuff that people don't say about Madiba, and I warm up to it. Also, it also takes me a long time to warm up into it, whatever.
In the process of making his film, Khalo has gathered an array of fresh, complex, and often contradictory views on Mandela.
Mandela is limitless. What is the problem is that our imaginations has been limited about how we should imagine it.
Mandela was a visionary who understood that getting bogged down in the sins and horrors and atrocities of the past was the way to guarantee that those sins and horrors and atrocities would be perpetuated ad infinitum.
It takes a superhuman black person to be like, it's all good. And I'm not that superhuman. I'd love to be able to just forgive like that, honestly. But I can't, the history is too vast. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we're expected to forgive in the space of less than a decade.
South Africa has been an unjust society in relation to the disadvantaged people of the country for 3.5 centuries. It's a difficult task to bring equality and justice for all within 17 years after 3.5 centuries of suffering.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
As the Mandela era ends, Khalo's questions around his meaning and legacy are becoming more urgent.
I've been thinking about my memory of Nelson Mandela when I was a child. Did I make it up? Or did my grandmother really tell me? And I like this idea where there is a sense where you cannot rely on memory.
Thank you. Let's move on. Thank you. If Julia is happy, I'm happy. Because the last shot for here. Yeah.
Khalo's letter to Mandela comes at a time when the whole of South Africa is re-examining Mandela's legacy and asking whether his philosophy remains relevant in a world still governed by conflict and inequality. It's a letter being sent to a great man, but also one that will travel the world.
We want no makeup, we won't see it, we are shooting from far. Julio knows he's going up there. We need a wider shot.
Because I'm not too religious, because I have very little faith in human beings, because of the disappointment that I've had in my life, because of fear of disappointments, I try not to put my faith in human beings. I try to use human beings as the questions that I would like to ask. And the question is, can we really escape our past? You know, is it possible? And I think that most intellectuals, okay, and most people on the left undermine the understanding that majority of black people, especially black women, understood. They understood that their lives could never change. Okay, they understood that their lives will never change by Mandela's idea of reconciliation and forgiveness. But they had hoped that their children and their grandchildren's lives would be different. And the question then becomes, is their life, they understood that they were the sacrificial lambs. What people do not accept is the fact that their children, and it looks like their grandchildren's lives, are going to mirror their own lives. That is what is scary, I think, for most people.
While the legacy of Nelson Mandela will be debated well into the future, he remains an inspiration for many in the fight for freedom and democracy all over the world. Khalo's film is one step towards understanding this complex and important man.